8 foot tall, or Hachi-shakusama, is a Japanese urban legend about a tall woman who abducts children. She is 8 feet tall and wears a long white dress, making a sound like bo, 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 bo. My grandparents lived in Japan. Every summer, my parents would take me there on holiday to visit them. They lived in a small village and they had a big backyard. I loved playing there during the summer. When we arrived, my grandparents would always welcome me with open arms. Since I was the only grandchild, they spoiled me. Last time I saw them was the summer when I was 8 years old. As usual, my parents booked a flight to Japan and we drove there from the airport to my grandparents' house. They were delighted to see me and had a lot of presents to give me. My parents wanted to take some time by themselves, so after a few days, they took a trip to another part of Japan, leaving me in the care of my grandma and grandpa. One day, I was playing out in the backyard. My grandparents were inside the house. It was a hot summer's day, and I lay down on the grass to rest. I stared up at the clouds and enjoyed the feeling of the soft rays of sun and the gentle breeze. Just as I was about to get up, I heard a strange sound. Po, 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 po. I didn't know what it was, and it was hard to figure out where it was coming from. It sounded almost like someone was making the noise themselves, as if they were trying to say, po, 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 over and over again in a deep, masculine voice. I was looking around, searching for the source of the noise, when I suddenly saw something at the top of the tall hedges that enclosed the backyard. It was a straw hat. It wasn't resting on the hedge, it was behind it. That's where the sound was coming from. Po, 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 po. Then the hat began to move, as if someone was wearing it. The hat stopped at a small gap in the hedge, and I could see a face peering through. It was a woman, but the hedges were too high, almost 8 feet tall. I was surprised at how tall the woman was. I wondered if she was wearing stilts or some sort of huge high-heel shoes. Then a split second later, she walked off, and the strange sound disappeared with her, fading into the distance. Bewildered, I got up and wandered back into the house. My grandparents were in the kitchen drinking tea. I sat down at the table, and after a while, I told my grandparents what I had seen. They weren't really paying attention until I mentioned that distinctive sound. Po, 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 po. As soon as I said that, both of them suddenly froze. Grandma's eyes grew wide, and she covered her mouth with her hand. Grandpa's face became very serious, and he grabbed me by the arm. "This is very important," he said in an intense voice. "You must tell us exactly. How tall was she?" "As tall as the garden hedge," I replied, beginning to get scared. My grandfather bombarded me with questions. "Where was she standing? When did this happen? What did you do? Did she see you?" I tried to answer all his questions the best I could. He suddenly rushed around the hallway and made a phone call. I couldn't hear what he was saying. I looked over at my grandma and she was trembling. Grandpa came barging back into the room and spoke to my grandmother. "I've got to go for a while," he said. "You stay here with the child. Don't take your eyes off him for a second." "What's going on, Grandpa?" I cried. He looked at me with a sad expression and said, "You've been liked by Hachi-shakusama." With that, he hurried out, and he got into his truck and drove off. I turned to my grandmother and cautiously asked, "Who is Hachi-shakusama?" "Don't worry," she said in a shaking voice. "Grandpa will do something. There's no need for you to worry." As we sat nervously in the kitchen waiting for my grandfather to come back, she explained what was happening. She told me there was a dangerous thing haunting the area. They called it Hachi-shakusama because of its height. In Japanese, Hachi-shakusama means 8 feet tall. It takes the appearance of an extremely tall woman, and it makes a sound like po, 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 in a deep male voice. It appears slightly different depending on who's seeing it. Some say it looks like a haggard old woman in a kimono. Others say it is a girl in a white funeral shroud. One thing that never changed was its height and the sound it makes. A long time ago, it was captured by monks, and they managed to confine it in the ruined building on the outskirts of the village. They trapped it using 4 small religious statues called Jizos that they placed on the north, south, east, and west of the ruins. It wasn't supposed to be able to move from there, but somehow it managed to escape. The last time it appeared was 15 years ago. My grandmother said that anyone who saw it 8 feet tall was destined to die within a few days. It all sounded crazy. I wasn't sure what to believe. When my grandpa came back, there was an old woman with him. She introduced herself as Kei-san and handed me a small, crumpled-up piece of parchment, saying, "Here, take this and hold it." Then she and my grandpa went upstairs to do something. I was left alone in the kitchen with my grandmother again. I needed to go to the toilet. Granny followed me to the bathroom and wouldn't let me shut the door. I was beginning to get really frightened by all this. After a while, my grandma and Kei-san took me upstairs and brought me into my bedroom. The windows were covered in newspaper, and a lot of ancient runes had been written on them. There were small bowls of salt in all 4 corners of the room, and a small Buddha figure placed in the center on top of a wooden box, and there was a bright blue bucket. "What's the bucket for?" I asked. "That's for your pee and poo," Grandpa said. Kei-san sat me down on the bed and said, "Soon the sun will be setting, so listen carefully. You must stay in this room until tomorrow morning. You must not come out under any circumstances until 7 o'clock in the morning. Your grandmother and grandfather will not speak to you or call you until then. Remember, do not leave this room for any reason until then. I will let your parents know what is going on." She spoke in such a grave tone that all I could do was quietly nod my head. "You have to follow Kei-san's instructions to the letter," Grandpa told me. "And never let go of that parchment she gave you. And if anything happens, pray to Buddha. And make sure you lock this door when we leave." They walked out into the hallway, and after saying goodbye to them, I closed the bedroom door and locked it. I turned on the TV and tried to watch, but I was so nervous I felt sick to my stomach. Grandma had left some snacks and rice balls for me, but I couldn't eat them. I felt like I was in prison. I was very depressed and scared. I lay down on the bed and waited. Before I knew it, I was asleep. When I woke up, it was just after 1 a.m. All of a sudden, I realized something was tapping on the window. Tap, 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 tap. I felt the blood draining from my face, and my heart skipped a beat. I desperately tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks, or maybe the branches of the tree. I turned up the volume on the TV to drown out the tapping noise. Eventually, it stopped altogether. Then, that's when I heard my grandpa calling me. "Are you okay in there?" he asked. "If you're scared, you don't have to stay in there all alone. I can come keep you company." I smiled and rushed over to the door, but then I stopped in my tracks. I had goosebumps all over my body. It sounded like my grandpa's voice, but somehow it was different. I couldn't tell what it was, but I knew. "What are you doing? You can open the door now." I glanced to my left, and a chill went down my spine. The salt in the bowls was slowly turning black. I backed away from the door. My whole body was trembling with fear. I fell to my knees in front of the Buddha statue. I clutched the piece of parchment tightly in my hand, and I desperately began praying for help. "Please save me from Hachi-shakusama," I wailed. Then I heard a voice outside the door saying, "Po, po, po, po." The tapping on the window started again. I was overcome by fear. I crouched in front of the statue, half crying, half praying for the rest of the night. I felt like it would never end. But eventually it was morning. The salt in all 4 bowls was pitch black. I checked my watch. It was 7:30 a.m. I cautiously opened the door. Grandma and Kei-san were standing outside waiting for me. When she saw my face, my grandma burst into tears. "I'm so glad you're still alive," she said. I went downstairs and was surprised to see my father and mother sitting in the kitchen. Grandpa came in and said, "Hurry, we've got to get going." When we went to the front door, there was a large black van waiting in the driveway. Several men from the village were standing around it, pointing at me, whispering, "That's the boy." The van was a 9-seater, and they put me in the middle, surrounded by 8 men. Kei-san was in the driver's seat. The man on my left looked down at me and said, "You got yourself in quite a spot of trouble. I know you're probably worried. Just keep your head down and your eyes shut. We can't see it, but you can. Don't open your eyes till we're safely out of here." Grandpa drove in front, and my dad's car was following behind. Everyone was ready. Our little convoy started moving. We were going fairly slow, around 20 kilometers an hour, maybe less. After a while, Kei-san said, "This is where it gets hard," and started muttering a prayer under her breath. That's when I heard the voice. "Po, po, po, po." I clenched the parchment Kei-san had given me tightly in my hand. I kept my head down, but I peeked outside. I saw the white dress fluttering in the breeze. It was moving along with the van. It was Hachishakusama. She was outside the window, but she was keeping pace with us. Then suddenly, she bent down and peered into the van. "No!" I gasped. The man behind me shouted, "Keep your eyes shut!" I immediately shut my eyes as hard as I could and tightened my grip on the piece of parchment. Then the tapping began. Tap, 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 tap. The voice became louder. "Po! Po! Po! Po!" There was tapping on the windows all around us. All of the men in the van were startled and on edge, muttering nervously to themselves. They couldn't see 8 feet tall. They couldn't hear her voice, but they could hear the tapping on the windows. Kei-san started praying louder and louder until she was almost shouting. The tension in the van was almost unbearable. After a while, the tap stopped, and the voice disappeared. Kei-san looked back at us and said, "I think we're safe now." All of the men around me breathed a sigh of relief. The van pulled over onto the side of the road, and the men got out. They transferred me into my dad's car. My mother held me close. Tears were running down her cheek. Grandpa and my father bowed to the men, and they went on their way. Kei-san came to the window and asked me to show her the piece of parchment she had given me. When I opened my hand, I saw it had gone completely black. "I think you'll be okay for now," she said, "but be sure to hold on to this for a little while." She handed me a new piece of parchment. After that, we drove away to the airport, and my grandpa saw us off on the plane. When we took off, my parents breathed a sigh of relief. My father told me he had heard about 8 feet tall before. Years ago, his friend had been liked by her, too. The boy disappeared and was never seen again. My father said there were other people who had been liked by her and lived to tell about it. They all had to leave Japan and settle down in foreign countries. They were never able to go back to their homeland. She always chooses children as her victims. They say because children are dependent on their parents and family members, this makes them easier to deceive when she poses as their relatives. He said the men in the van were all blood relatives of mine, and that's why they'd been sitting all around me, and why my father and Grandpa had been driving in the front and back. It was all done to try to confuse her. It took a while to contact everyone and get them together, so that is why I had to be confined in a room all night. He had told me that one of the little Jizo statues, the ones that were meant to keep her trapped, had been broken, and that's how she escaped. It gave me chills. I was glad to be finally back home. All this happened 10 years ago. I hadn't seen my grandparents since. I hadn't been able to set so much as a foot in the country. Afterwards, I would call them every few weeks and talk to them over the phone. Over the years, I tried to convince myself it was just an urban legend, that everything that had happened was just some elaborate prank. Sometimes I'm not too sure. My grandfather died 2 years ago. He was sick. He wouldn't allow me to visit him and left strict instructions in his will that I wasn't to attend his funeral. It was all very sad. My grandma called a few days ago. She said that she had been diagnosed with cancer. She missed me terribly and wanted to see me one last time before she died.
Are you sure, Grandma?
I asked.
Is it safe? It's been 10 years,
she said.
It all happened a long time ago. It's all forgotten. You're grown up now. I'm sure there won't be a problem. But what about her?
I said. For a moment, there was silence on the other end of the phone. Then, I heard a deep, masculine voice saying,